Picture this. You walk onto a Detroit dealership lot in the dead of winter, 1973 turning into 1974. Rows of brand new Cadillacs, big block Chevelles, loaded Continentals, and four-barrel Mustangs sit there like abandoned ships. Snow on the hoods, price tags still hanging, nobody is buying. Sales managers are drinking coffee that tastes like panic. One guy later swore he would have taken almost anything just to move metal. That is how fast the world flipped. 1 month, Americans were still flexing V8s like they owned the planet. The next month, those same engines felt like financial suicide. This is the story of the night Detroit's golden age got gut-punched by oil, and ordinary people started dumping their dream cars while tiny Toyotas and Datsuns suddenly looked like pure genius. Before we get into the wreckage, you have to understand how cocky Detroit was. For decades, the big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, ruled the American road like it was their private driveway. Bigger was better. More chrome, more cylinders, more cubic inches. A 350 cubic inch V8 was practically entry-level. 400s and 454s were the real toys. Muscle cars still had residual swagger even after emissions rules and insurance rates started chipping away at them. Land yachts with vinyl tops and opera windows filled suburban driveways. Gas was cheap enough that most folks did not even look at the mileage sticker. You filled up, paid pocket change, and rolled on. That attitude was the entire business model. Detroit bet the farm that Americans would always want big, thirsty, proud automobiles. Then October 1973 arrived and the bet went up in smoke. It started half a world away. Egypt and Syria hit Israel on Yom Kippur. The United States resupplied Israel with a massive arms package. Arab oil producers answered with an embargo. They cut production and shut off oil to the United States and a few other countries that backed Israel. Oil that had been sitting around $3 a barrel rocketed toward $12. In months, the price roughly quadrupled. At the pump, the pain hit ordinary people immediately. Average regular gas that had been hovering near 38 or 39 cents a gallon climbed hard. By the middle of 1974, it was sitting around 55 cents and higher in many places. That may sound laughable now, but for a country that had lived on cheap energy for a generation, it felt like the floor disappearing under their feet. Suddenly the lines appeared. Real lines. Cars snaking around blocks for hours just to get a few gallons. Stations ran dry. Signs went up. No gas. Odd even rationing started in some states. Last digit of your plate decided which day you could even try. People siphoned tanks. Fights broke out. The national speed limit got slammed down to 55 miles per hour to stretch every drop. Pleasure driving felt unpatriotic. And every single time you filled a big V8, you felt the meter spinning like a slot machine that only took your money. That is when the math changed inside people's heads. That 454 under the hood of the Caprice suddenly looked less like freedom and more like a monthly bill you could not control. Here is where the market turned vicious. Dealerships that had been fat on full-size cars and muscle leftovers woke up to a nightmare inventory. Full-size Fords, Chevys, and Chryslers that had been easy movers now sat. Trade-in values on gas-guzzlers cratered relative to what people expected. Nobody wanted to take a 3-ton Cadillac with a thirsty V8 when the next fill-up felt like a second rent payment. Old salesmen still talk about that winter like it was a war zone. They would take almost any deal just to clear the lot. Some owners who needed cash or simply could not afford to feed the beast walked away from cars that months earlier had been status symbols. Were they literally selling for pennies? Not every single one. But the collapse in demand was so sharp that plenty of beautiful, low-mileage American iron traded for fractions of what the owners thought they were worth. That is the part that still stings collectors today. And what did they buy instead? Tiny, honest, fuel-sipping imports. Datsuns, Toyotas. The Honda Civic was just starting to make noise. Volkswagen still had its Beetle and the Rabbit coming. These cars were not sexy in the old Detroit sense. No opera windows, no dual exhaust roar. But they got real miles per gallon. They started every morning. They did not drink a week's grocery money every time you touched the pump. Suddenly, the guy who traded his Cadillac for a Toyota Corolla did not look crazy. He looked smart. One famous example is Ted Turner. The future media titan traded his Cadillac for a Toyota Corolla right after the embargo hit and never really looked back. That story is documented. Ordinary families did the same thing by the thousands. The psychological shift was brutal. American pride used to mean a big V8. Overnight, it started to mean not going broke at the gas station. Detroit was not ready. Not even close. The product mix was wrong. The engineering culture was still built around big engines and long hoods. They had been dabbling in smaller cars, the Vega, the Pinto, the Gremlin, but those programs were half-hearted or plagued with quality problems. The Vega rusted and overheated. The Pinto became a punchline for all the wrong reasons. Meanwhile, Toyota and Datsun had spent years refining small, efficient cars for markets that never had cheap gas, the way America did. When the crisis hit, the Japanese were already standing there with the right product. Import sales that had been a nuisance became a flood. By the end of the decade, Japanese makers were selling millions of cars a year in the United States. Almost 1 out of every 4 cars sold carried a foreign badge. That was unthinkable only a few years earlier. Look at the raw numbers from that period, and you can feel the air leave the room. 1973 had been a record sales year, roughly 9.7 million cars. 1974 crashed hard. Total industry sales dropped to around 7.5 million. Full-size cars took the worst beating. Chrysler posted a shocking $52 million loss for 1974, the worst in its history at that point. Ford's profits got hammered. General Motors still had scale, but even the giant felt the pain. Factories slowed. Layoffs started. The long spiral that would eventually lead to later bailouts and decades of market share erosion had its first real public chapter right here. People like to argue about whether the oil crisis alone killed the muscle car. The truth is more layered. Emissions rules from the Clean Air Act of 1970, rising insurance costs, and the switch to net horsepower ratings had already been strangling the big horsepower party for a couple of years. Compression ratios dropped, camshafts got soft, the 455s and 429s of the glory years were already ghosts by 1973. The embargo did not invent the malaise era. It poured gasoline on a fire that was already burning and then made every remaining gas guzzler look like a liability. That combination finished the old order. Walk through a dealership service department in those months and you would have heard the conversations. Guys who had just bought a new Caprice or LTD the previous spring were now asking about trade values with a sick look on their faces. Sales managers were pushing the few small cars they had and praying corporate would ship more. Some dealers started bringing in used Datsuns and Toyotas just to have something people actually wanted. The cultural humiliation was almost worse than the financial hit. America had spent 50 years teaching the world how to build cars. Now the world was teaching America how to build cars that did not waste fuel. That sting never fully left Detroit. The government scrambled. Project Independence got announced. The national 55-mile-per-hour limit became law. Later came corporate average fuel economy standards that forced the industry to hit 18 miles per gallon fleet average by 1978 and keep climbing. Catalytic converters became mandatory. The cars that came out of that regulatory storm were often weaker and less fun. But they were the only cars Detroit was allowed, and eventually forced to build. Meanwhile, the Japanese just kept improving. Reliability, fit and finish, real-world mileage. The gap widened. Here is the part that still makes old-school car guys shake their heads. The big three had the money, the factories, the engineering talent, and the dealer networks. They just did not have the urgency until it was too late. For years, the small car market was treated like a necessary evil or a temporary fad. Americans will always come back to big cars was practically a religion in the executive suites. The 1973 shock proved that religion wrong in the most expensive way possible. When the second oil crisis hit at the end of the decade, the lesson got driven home again with even more force. Chrysler nearly died. Ford and GM bled market share for years. The long spiral was real. It was not one single collapse, but 1973 was the moment the ground first gave way. I want you to feel the human side of it. Imagine the factory worker in Flint or Dearborn who spent 20 years building 4-barrel carburetors, and suddenly the plant is cutting shifts because nobody wants the cars those carburetors go into. Imagine the suburban dad who bought the loaded Impala as a reward for years of hard work, and now spends every Sunday morning in a gas line, wondering if he made a terrible mistake. Imagine the young guy who finally got his hands on a used GTO, only to watch its value evaporate while his buddy in a Datsun laughs all the way to the bank every fill-up. That is the texture of the collapse. Not just balance sheets. Real people watching their automotive identity get rewritten overnight. The used car lots became graveyards for yesterday's dreams. Big American iron with 350 and 400 engines sat longer and longer. Some cars that should have been pride and joy machines got parted out early or sold cheap just to free up cash. At the same time, the little Japanese cars that Americans used to mock as tin cans started holding value and flying off lots. Status flipped. Efficiency became the new flex. That cultural reversal is what the oil crisis really delivered. It did not just raise the price of gas, it rewired what Americans thought a car was supposed to be. Detroit eventually learned. Downsizing programs accelerated, front-wheel drive platforms arrived, fuel injection replaced carburetors. Quality slowly improved under the pressure of Japanese competition. By the middle of the 1980s, some American cars were genuinely good again. But the damage from that first shock never fully healed. The reputation for building only gas-guzzling land yachts stuck for a generation. Import buyers who switched in 1974 often never came back. Their kids grew up in Camrys and Accords. That generational loss of loyalty is the real long-term cost. Was every V8 worthless garbage? Of course not. Plenty of well-kept examples survived and later became collectible. The market eventually recovered for the best muscle and full-size cars, but in the moment, in the winter of 73 into 74, many of those cars felt worthless to the people who owned them. That emotional truth is what the dramatic titles capture. When you cannot afford to put gas in it and nobody wants to take it in trade, the car might as well be garbage no matter how beautiful the sheet metal is. That is the brutal arithmetic of an energy shock. Look at the photos from those months if you ever get the chance. Long lines of big American cars snaking toward a gas station that may or may not still have fuel. Drivers sitting on hoods, smoking, waiting. The contrast is almost funny now. These massive chrome and vinyl battleships reduced to waiting like beggars for a few gallons of expensive gasoline. That image is the perfect visual of the entire era. Detroit had built the cars that defined American freedom. Then freedom got a price tag the country was not ready to pay. The embargo itself only lasted until March of 1974. The higher oil prices never really went away. The psychological scar lasted decades. Every time gas spikes even a little, older Americans still flinch and remember the lines. Every time a new generation of big trucks and SUVs dominates the market, someone brings up 1973 as the cautionary tale. The industry learned, forgot, relearned, and is still arguing about the lessons. Electric vehicles and efficiency standards today are just the latest chapter of the same conversation that started when those first Arab oil tankers stopped sailing west. So when you see a pristine 1972 or 73 big block American car today at a cruise night, understand what you are looking at. You are looking at a survivor of an economic and cultural earthquake. That car almost became worthless overnight. Its original owner may have traded it in a panic for something with half the cylinders and twice the mileage. The fact that any of them made it through the 70s intact is a small miracle. They are rolling monuments to the last moment, when Detroit still believed bigger would always be better, right before the world proved them wrong. The oil crisis of 1973 did not just raise the price of gas. It ended an era of automotive innocence. It forced America to grow up about energy. It opened the door for the Japanese invasion that permanently changed the competitive landscape. And it taught a generation of car guys that the most powerful engine in the world is useless if you cannot afford to feed it. That lesson still echoes every time you stand at a pump watching the dollars climb. Detroit never fully recovered the swagger it lost that winter. The Big Three survived, reinvented themselves, and still build great vehicles. But the days when a 454 under the hood meant you had won at life? Those days died in the gas lines of 1973 and 74, and a whole lot of beautiful American V8s got dumped for whatever people could get, sometimes damn near pennies, just so their owners could keep moving. If this story hit you the way it still hits me, you already know why we keep telling it. The cars we love are never just metal. They are time capsules of the moments that shaped us. Drop a comment and tell me if your family lived through those lines or if somebody in your crew still owns a car that got rescued from that crash. Hit like if you want more deep dives into the moments that broke and rebuilt the American car. And subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Drive safe out there and never take cheap gas for granted.